How are you, Manuel Martinez?
Good morning. Well, you?
With our audience, which has shown a tremendous response, we delve into the subject of the texts or the apocryphal Gospels. One of the most striking aspects is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. We would be interested in exploring how much. When you brought up the writer Saramago, José Saramago, it might be seen as either a literary work or perhaps even a modern gospel.
Well, José Saramago attempts to write a new gospel. We might say novelized, but he aims to share his vision of what Christ represented, his time on earth, his relationship with God as God's Son, and its implications in the history of humanity over the last 2,000 years is his novel's aim. So, well, maybe before we delve into this novel, I mentioned it's a novel, often debated. The novel was written in 91, is banned in Portugal. An interesting fact, since Portugal is a secular country, but the government fears it may offend the country's large Catholic majority. This ban led to José Saramago being vetoed for the European Prize of Letters that year, which seemed likely to be awarded to him, but it sparked a major controversy. José Saramago has always been an author known for being very controversial, a highly controversial author. If you like, we can begin with his life to understand his origins and what his own origin is. You see, José Saramago was born in the village of Asinaga. Asinaga is a very small village located about 120 kilometers away from Lisbon. His parents are peasants, specifically landless peasants. This means they work the land, belonging to an owner who hires them and has them working on it. His mother is illiterate, and his father can barely write to him and only knows how to do the basic accounts. He was born on the 16th day of November in the year 1922. As a child, he felt a major social issue within. He wondered since childhood, why my parents work all day, but don't own the land, earning a poor wage. He begins school, a village school. Imagine what that was like. About a distance of 120 kilometers from Lisbon, there is one thing to note. The education he receives is quite basic. At the age of 12, he always read whatever little he could find to read, as there were not many books available due to the absence of libraries, and there was nothing else in this small village. However, when he was just 3 years old, he moved to Lisbon. The family relocates to Lisbon. The father continues manual labor, but each year they visit the village 2 or 3 times, which he claims are his roots, not Lisbon, but the village where he was born. At 12, his father can't afford his studies, so he enters an industrial training school, studying to become a mechanic. He might be the only Nobel Prize winner we know who didn't attend university. He later wins the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1998. He never attended college, though today He received honorary doctorates from many universities. He learned to write through reading. So although he knows all the grammar rules for the first time, writing, his style is unique, never seen before, as he rarely uses periods, commas, or dashes when characters speak. It can be hard to read him, because if you don't pay attention, you might not know who's speaking or answering. He can write you a sentence, meaning a dialogue spoken there without commas, like a page, without a comma or punctuation, meaning what defines him as a writer. Well, not easily digestible by the general public. Yet, Saramago has achieved immense popularity when he's described as a writer. Which era does he truly belong to? Let's explore his origins. He penned his debut book back in the year 1966, and it's a book with little success. Well, sorry, in 1947 he writes his first book, and it has no impact. Now, Saramago doesn't write for 20 years, so he keeps working, stops being a mechanic, and starts at an insurance company then. He works for various Portuguese newspapers as a journalist and reporter. But it isn't until 20 years later that he writes a book. When asked how a writer can wait so long, he responds, without writing and seeing himself as a writer. And he mentions, since he's a writer who is quite human and straightforward, well, it's simply because he didn't have anything to express or communicate. He had absolutely nothing to share with anyone. So why would he write something that nobody would find interesting? Starting from 1966, when he writes a minor work, he begins to gain some attention. But truly, when he becomes significant, it is during the 80 years when he starts to be recognized as a cult writer. And his major success, let's say, in terms of novel writing, is when he writes the Gospel according to Jesus Christ. That's where we left off with the apocryphal Gospels. What is Jesus Christ's Gospel? José Saramago presents several ideas. The first part of the book focuses on Joseph, Jesus' father, of whom we have little history. As mentioned before, some Gospels suggest he might have been married before explaining Jesus' brothers, and then he married Mary. The initial section of this book is truly gripping, because what Saramago delves into is the complex nature of guilt. Now, what exactly is this guilt about? The angel is meant to alert Joseph that there will be a massive slaughter of children as ordered by Herod. So, what action does Joseph take? Save Jesus. Take him away. He takes Jesus. But Joseph doesn't warn his neighbors about the coming massacre where children are slaughtered. That guilt complex, it haunts Joseph throughout his life. Joseph carries a guilt complex thinking, I saved my son, but others died instead. This is the first part of the book that explores Joseph's guilt. But what unfolds? Joseph's guilt is transferred to Jesus, illustrating how we are shaped by our parents and ultimately bear their guilt. Jesus becomes somewhat of a co-conspirator in that guilt simultaneously. It's quite an impressive drama, portrayed in the novel with Joseph's feelings, which never seem to leave him. He experiences dreams, witnessing the massacres, and those dreams are then passed on to Jesus. How does it all end? During one of Joseph's trips in the region, remember our discussion? If you recall, Judas and the Zealots encouraged rebellion against the Roman Empire. Joseph finds himself caught in the midst of this zealot uprising. Consequently, the Roman soldiers arrest Joseph. Joseph, well, I have nothing to do with this uprising. However, Joseph is put in line with all those who have been arrested, with those who were to be crucified. And indeed, at 33 years old, Joseph is crucified and dies on the cross. He feels it like to pay the guilt, to spy the guilt for not having helped the other children. That is, it is a reflection. It is a very philosophical theme. To what extent our children are guilty of our actions if they have benefited them is an intriguing topic treated like gospel, because we continually see movies that you see that parents do anything to save their children that have accused them of a crime or a rape and end up blaming others so that nothing happens to their children, a common and recurring theme in many television series, which now the theme this puts it with a much greater seriousness. Yes, Jesus is saved, but how many died by him? In theory, he was the Messiah. Then his father's nation causes many innocents to die, though we should digress about the famous slaughter of innocents. This isn't in the novel, but Bethlehem was a small village. As historians suggest, it likely had around 1,000 to 1,500 people living there. If we were to kill all the children born in the last 2 years in Bethlehem, how many would that be? 12 or 14 children. Not many more than that. We've seen in movies and religion classes that Herod killed thousands of children, but how could he kill thousands under 2 years old? When Bethlehem only had about 1,500 inhabitants, these are other historical inaccuracies, I tell you. But I wanted to emphasize the slaughter of innocents wasn't so large for the number of children, under 2 in a population of 1,500. But returning to the crucifixion of Joseph, at the age of 33, because Joseph is crucified and Jesus is left orphan, logically he leaves home. He is young, 15, 16 years old, and he's searching for a purpose in life, unsure of his mission. Then, along the way, he encounters a shepherd. This shepherd shares worldly things, events that might occur. And later, we see this shepherd is the devil. And it refers to the well-known temptation of Jesus by the devil when he is in the desert for 40 days. You might recall that gospel passage. Here it shifts to this pastor. And now we arrive at one of the most significant highlights of the entire novel. This is the moment the devil extends an invitation to Jesus to step into a boat, and he also extends this invitation to God the Father, to descend. Thus, we witness a tripartite meeting involving the supposed God the Son, who is Jesus, God the Father, who is Jehovah, and the devil himself. They start discussing the future. That's when Jesus starts. I'll read a portion. He starts questioning, what's my mission? Why? God the Father, do you want me to sacrifice myself? For then God the Dad is that it is between gods. And that is exactly where. And that's why I tell you, this is the point that I explore in the novel, because he already discusses gods. We as gods are not allowed to enter and solve human issues. This is to say that God or the gods, in whatever we want to live, will never intervene in our life. In other words, thanking or asking God doesn't make sense, because the gods or God have left us alone. This is one of the points often raised. About the gods, it might know. And Jesus asked the Father, all this, despite the devil's interruptions, the devil tells Jesus what he will sacrifice for. He presents the devil as another God, like in my book. What will you sacrifice for your Father? He asked the good guy, what do you want from this? I want with your sacrifice, I will gain many followers who choose me over other gods. But why? Your death must be violent. You need to be a martyr, because that's what draws people. Martyrdom, a God who comes and dies as a martyr, sacrificed, tortured. It will help us for the next 2,000 years to become the most powerful. So the devil steps in and you're good. But at what cost? You'll be the most powerful Libyans. Then the devil shows a list of martyrs for the next 2.0 years in the church. Hundreds, thousands of martyrs. He'll tell you about the religious wars causing millions of deaths, and continues about the wars of conquest to implant the true faith, says the devil, and all that will be done in your name. Says, is it worth all that in your name? You'll be the bloodiest God in your name. Who will know history, as millions will die in the... These are methodologies that, when examined from a historical perspective, or religions have only brought wars. Trying to implant their God by force to other cultures, that has been a historical thing.
Let's take a look at Manuel. By setting the context first, does he, in the Gospel according to Jesus, imply that this writer is presenting a new argument that differs from those used or interpreted from the canonical Gospels and aligns more closely with the apocryphal Gospels?
Well, I believe it's not similar to the canonical or apocryphal Gospels. He shares his perspective on what he thinks was Christ's life and the significance of his death, from a historical view of the legacy we've inherited, which is the Bible, and what we know from all the Apocrypha. But he creates his own version of this. He crafts a version of it and believes it happened this way, though he always clarifies it is a novel, not meant to offend, just a novel because it depicts a fully human Jesus. I tell you, like the meeting on the boat, devil, God the Father and Christ, because it results in that after this, Christ tells him he doesn't want to die. I don't want to die for this reason. He asks, why should I do it? You must follow the Father's orders, and I need to be the most powerful God. Wow, you must do it. He ends the meeting. Jesus then leaves, utterly confused, not fully understanding. He must die for God the Father to be the most powerful God alone. And he walks a long time. His feet are almost destroyed from walking, and he reaches Bethany. There, he sees a house and knocks. Mary Magdalene is in that house, who's older than him, and Mary Magdalene. Wait, I tell you about that first meeting. What he says, why? It's stunning. How can I be your beloved if you don't know me? Mary Magdalene says this, or Jesus to her, are you my beloved? How can I be yours if you don't know me? If I'm just someone asking for help and you pity my pain and ignorance, Jesus recognizes his ignorance. That is the reason I love you, because I've been there to help and teach you, yet you won't be able to love me, since you neither taught nor helped me. You no longer have any wounds, but you will find them if you search for them. What, my dear, is it? It mentions that open door, the one through which others entered while my beloved did not. Is where the first reference to Mary Magdalene as a prostitute is found. That door through which others passed and you did not. But once you entered through that door is closed to others and open only for you, meaning she has already given up. Sex work was her life then, because she, after this, the preaching of Jesus continues a bit and eventually leads to his death. And what about Mary Magdalene? In the novel, they live together. And yes, they have a relationship. But it never mentions if they have a daughter, like in the Da Vinci Code. And this is where, finally, Christ dies on the cross at 33, just like his Father, bearing part of the guilt he carried for the sins of the Father, which to save him allowed many other children to die. So, the core and fundamental concept Saramago leaves us with, the idea of guilt, I mention again, returning to the series, those guilts, those actions a parent might take to save their child, disregarding who they harm, questions that the relationship with Mary Magdalene is beautifully depicted in the book. A love at first sight. A meeting between the devil, God, and Jesus is unique in the literature, planning this dialogue between the two gods, the Father and the devil, and one who is going to be God, who is going to be enthroned as the highest God there is, to carry out a mission that he did not want, and that the traditional Gospels themselves raise the doubts that Christ has. When making that sacrifice, what good will it do? This is where the devil intervenes, saying, look, your sacrifice will lead to millions dead. Millions dead. So God the Father becomes the most powerful. Essentially, he brings up polytheism as discussed, as I mentioned in my book, and the opposing moral causes.
Let's consider Manuel. Here we encounter a Christ figure, a Jesus who represents the aspect of himself that hesitates to embrace divinity, or is it rather the more human side that resists becoming divine?
It's both. He doesn't want to be divine or die for something he doesn't get. But the essential and fundamental concept is who's dying and why. How will my death save others? If I can't save them from guilt, we all carry guilt inside. It's the concept of guilt. As we all have some guilt inside from childhood or later issues. But the guilt stays within us. Oh, I'm not solving anything. What will I solve with that? So he doesn't understand. It's a concept beyond him. And he finds happiness with Mary Magdalene. The moral crisis arises. Why should I give up my happiness to die on the cross? Just to please the one claiming to be my father? Or when Joseph was my father, the one who was criticized, Joseph was my father. This God. Well, I didn't know him until he appeared to me here. Yes, I've seen him in visions, but I don't know who this God is. All these problems, moral dilemmas, what's posed in the novel, not understanding why he dies and even dying because he doesn't want to have died. Knowing his death and martyrdom will bring more pain than joy on the world. More pain than joy for millions dying for his cause, defending the true faith. Then the gods, as Saramago says in the book, cannot intervene. They exist but do not interfere in our lives, making us the interveners of those lives. And in the end, we're left there. The stronger ones become gods. That's the general context of this work. It was ultra controversial. Many countries, it's a brutal gospel concept.
Manuel, that's where the apocryphal Gospel of Mary Magdalene might hold validity, discussing her possible relationship with Christ. Man.
Logically speaking, a part of this narrative involving Christ and Mary Magdalene, as told by José Saramago, is derived from that gospel based on an interpretation of it. Furthermore, in today's world, new authors suggest to us that, in fact, there are ancient papyri available which mention the wedding between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. This suggests that even if this were proven true, it should not have any impact on the faith held by believers. What difference would it make if Jesus married Mary Magdalene and was crucified, or if he was celibate? This is central to Christianity. I don't think this will impact you much. Perhaps, as we talked about the other day, women at that time were considered impure. Women were impure and did not have access to the kingdom of heaven. Well, it is Jesus who comes to change that through his relationship with Mary Magdalene. That concept and women after Christ with Christianity are worthy of salvation comes to modify the social norms. All this history that we have of religions in the world.
Excuse me, a parenthesis. Here is a Christ, a Jesus, reluctant to his mission, to his destiny. That part where you talk about the devil meeting God and him would be the turning point where he could have lost his divine part and strengthened his human part, is perhaps the most important point in what is the mission that we all have as our destiny.
Well, we could say yes, when we face our own reality, when we realize who we are. Jesus in that meeting with the devil and with God, realizes who he is and that he is being used. Beware that he is being used. I truly believe that one of the main points of this situation is that they are utilizing him to establish a future religion which will serve to reinforce the concept of God, the Father. This is indeed one of the significant aspects, I think, the strongest of all this novel. As in our life, we are used by other people, by other institutions, to grant them greater power and authority, because it's important to remember that Saramago stands in opposition to power. He opposes authority. He thinks, discussing Saramago and his works, more on this, he believes, and that's why he's in my book, that today's world isn't run by visible leaders like presidents or prime ministers, no, but by a much more powerful hidden government not seen on TV or in the news, truly behind world events. He describes it in a straightforward manner as the governance by the multinationals. To put it somehow, the rule by the multinationals, which are the entities deciding what will occur within a country, implying that we have no say. He was discussing, as he was a close associate of the American author, the renowned writer Norman Mailer. And during a conversation with Norman Mailer, Bill Clinton will be the last US president. After him, multinationals won't need intermediaries. They'll directly rule the world. That's Norman Mailer, saying he doesn't understand our reality. In the book 22, it suggests there's a government, not necessarily official, a shadow controlling all. Now, we'll delve into some of his other books to try to grasp this, what is happening to us. One of his very successful books was The Cavern. He draws a comparison between today's society and the cave in Plato's The Republic. You remember the story of the cave where people are bound by chains inside it and can only see shadows. They cannot move from their place. So their vision and what they imagine are just shadows, only what can be. He describes, through this parable and novel, the current society as one that exists within a cave, and that what we perceive is not the reality, but rather what we imagine or desire to see. He suggests that we live in a world where man is trapped in his own cave. When considering the issues we face with COVID, it seems that this trend will continue to intensify each day. We live in our own caves. I work from my home, you from yours. Before, we had to be in a studio. Now I live in my cave, you in yours, and viewers are in theirs. That's it, what we see. May be imaginary, like what I'm saying here. You understand one way, someone else another. But nothing is real. Nothing we see is real. It's what we're told is real, and we choose to believe it as real. One basic theory of Saramago, as I said, he was very conflicting, yet not conflicting in itself, but his ideas are conflictive as they clash with the current model. He was very left-wing due to his impoverished childhood, believing in social equality. He expressed in his final conferences in 2010 that now the governments worldwide have been allowed, because we've been in our cave, to govern solely for the wealthy. And today, no government claims it can be one where a specific goal is pursued: to lift people from misery. He always criticized the high arms spending with global hunger, suggesting it was a consequence studied to create poverty. This earned him many enemies. He also won. After this, he wrote another book called Cain, for which, among other things, was banned from entering Israel. The book of Cain, intriguing, beginning with the Bible. It already challenged the traditional Christian gospel. And now it will challenge the New Testament, the Hebrew Bible. And it challenges and begins. Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's son. Cain and Abel offer a lamb sacrifice to God. Abel's smoke rises, Cain's does not. Abel is favored. Cain wonders why he is seen as bad. Patakai, and he can travel through time in the Bible. He visits Abraham, for instance, during the passage where Abraham is about to sacrifice Isaac. That the Lord Jehovah will be pleased. He asks, why kill your son to satisfy someone unknown? And why would Jehovah want your son? Then Sodom and Gomorrah, a famous phrase. If there were 40 righteous people, I'd forgive them. If 20, even if just one, then 2. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, and he says, well, what's the purpose of this destruction? In short, these are criticism of things in the Bible we've all questioned many times. Like, how is God going to ask you to sacrifice your son? And so he asks, isn't it because God wants to see how far you're willing to follow his will? How could it be such a cruel will that tells me to kill my son? So that God's own cruel will is what occurs in the gospel according to Jesus Christ, where Jesus' Father compels his son to sacrifice himself for his gain, for his power. Essentially, this is the most controversial from a religious perspective.
But Manuel, it is a very important point. Can he, as a writer, be considered a questioner or a blasphemer?
He doesn't question or blaspheme, mainly because he isn't a believer. How can he blaspheme if he doesn't believe? He doesn't believe in God. He's always said God and the Bible are human inventions, like the New Testament, or that they are just children's tales. Yet they have helped to keep society somewhat united. But if he doesn't believe, how can he blaspheme? You're a blasphemer when you believe in something. If you're Catholic and don't believe in Mary's virginity, you're a blasphemer for the church. But for non-believers, how can you call someone a blasphemer Well, blasphemer. Call me what you want. No, no. Goes like that. He doesn't care. He doesn't care. He says, I never thought I'd win a Nobel Prize. I wrote because I was eager to write, went 20 years without it, then wrote. My greatest prize isn't the Nobel, but my readers. People who read my work, that's my reward. Winning a Nobel Prize? Well, yes, money was very helpful. I'm one of the few writers who can say I make a living from my writing. But beyond that, these are things life brought to me. And I didn't foresee then, as he continues with his books that are a profound critique of the society. We live in another of Saramago's most debated books. And among the best you can read by him, better than, I tell you from a literary perspective and contribution, more than the gospel according to Jesus Christ, is the essay on blindness. The blindness trial starts in an ophthalmologist's office where a couple, a doctor and his wife, visit the husband's ophthalmology practice. He is a doctor, though not an ophthalmologist. Other patients are present, including a young woman with glasses, assumed to be a prostitute because in most of his books, Saramago typically avoids using names. He refers to characters like the doctor without naming them, such as the ophthalmologist, the young woman with glasses, and the doctor's wife. He doesn't use personal names. Instead, he generalizes it to apply to anyone. Then suddenly, what's happening? Yeah, with the ophthalmologist. And everyone goes blind except the doctor's wife, the ophthalmologist, the young woman with glasses, and a few other patients. So what happens? First, the phenomenon, as they can't define it, makes them think these people are crazy and they are taken to an asylum. But what happens? Suddenly, in this imaginary country, everyone loses their sight. Everyone goes blind. The metaphor is, in today's world, we live in a nation of blind people who choose not to see. Everyone there becomes blind, except for the doctor's wife, the only one who can see. The moral I find is that few among us can truly see, to understand the reality happening. As society turns blind, food issues arise. Naturally, production stops. Then everyone there gradually put the first ones who went blind into the asylum. And even thousands. Then society becomes blind in the streets. Initially, they sent food, unsure if it was a contagious disease causing blindness. So they left the food far away, abandoned for. Then what happened? The blind people form their own mafias to control the food. Then the first thing they ask for is the blind women's brains to be able to give the meals. Then there is abuse of these women inside this asylum by the strongest blind men. But what happens? One day this woman, one who sees that she is there, the unperceived, decides to end it. Then the chief of the blind stabs scissors into his neck, killing him. They go through a society shattered by blindness until finally people see again. No one ever knew that this woman could see, but little by little, people start to see again. They start to see. And little by little, try to go back to their previous lives, which logically can no longer be the same. The moral that I take from this novel is that we live in a blind society where there are very few people who can see. And if one day we were to awaken from that deep blindness, eventually, we would find ourselves returning to the same old things we used to do, reverting back to those familiar habits and encountering the same issues all over again. That even if we became completely blind, not as he says we are all blind, but physically blind, regaining our sight would help us change our bad habits. This book sparked controversy and was later adapted into a movie.
Manuel, if someone asked what contributed to you as a writer, what parallels exist between the gospel? According to Jesus, this writer, and your work 22, The War of the Gods?
Well, it certainly had an impact on me. Regarding the topic I mentioned to you, about the vast array of gods, even though the author is an atheist, keep in mind, when discussing gods, we can also refer to them as energies. In my book 22, I've always stated that the gods are at war with us. We are merely their soldiers. And we continually increase their power. We continually increase their power with 2 billion Christians. Christ, Jehovah, representing Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are immensely powerful because they have 2 billion soldiers ready to fight for them. Faith can be blind. You receive. The essay on blindness. At one point, as we've seen it, when the devil, Jesus, and God meet in the boat, discussing the Crusades, the Crusaders' blindness in their conquest of the Holy Land. That influenced me a lot in my vision, a little bit in my book. And how he talks about that government is in the shadows, as he refers to the multinationals, without naming them, because he claims we'll never truly know who they are, since you won't see them on TV. You won't see them in magazines. You won't find them anywhere. They know exactly who they are and won't reveal themselves to the public, which is also a theme in my novel of this group called This. Then we'll move to the next novel, Basic, in José Saramago, the essay on lucidity. Does the essay on lucidity? It is set in a country that is also imaginary, but that normally you always assume it is Portugal. You have a president, ministers, elections. Then people go to vote. Yet what occurs? 85% of them vote blank, saying they don't want anyone there. No one serves them. And the idea of democracy comes up. It says, what use are rulers to people who don't want them? So you vote for one. And if you dislike him, you can vote for the other. But they're not accountable for anything. And society is constantly being oppressed. Then the blank vote is the solution. How did he come up with the idea for this book? He was with Mário Soares, who was Portugal's prime minister for many years and also served as president. And they discussed this issue. If you don't vote socialist or social democrat, you end up voting for the Conservative Party, but there are no real options for change. And then Saramago posed the question, well, what if the people decided to vote blank? Well, if 15% of the population chose to vote blank, it would indeed be a very challenging blow for the leaders of the countries to handle. Then Saramago takes the twist of his novel even further and doesn't just suggest a 15% abstention. Instead, he imagines it at an astonishing 85, as if wanting to tell all the rulers to step aside, that it doesn't matter who they are, that none of them are useful, that they only exploit their privileges and their power to the detriment of normal people. So, in this novel, to start with, this is the 85%, where the rulers are convinced that a mistake has occurred, that indeed a mistake has occurred, and that nothing has actually gone wrong. They decide to hold the elections once more. In the subsequent elections, it turns out that a whopping 87% of the population ends up voting blank, as if saying, it wasn't a mistake, we don't want you. Then the government formed a coalition to add more weight, with the two main parties joining to see what's happening, declare an emergency, watch out. Because something's wrong, people are revealing themselves, but peacefully, simply with a blank vote. We love each other. We do. Then they start saying there's a plot. A plot exists. Who is leading this movement? Naturally, no one is leading the movement. Then they hear that some years ago, during the blindness outbreak, there was a woman who retained her sight. Logically, they assume this woman is behind it all. So they search for her, believing she's responsible for everything. Thus, Saramago suggests that the people who see, or a person who in the midst of that blindness was able to see, cause is always blamed the citizen who sees, or the politician's problem. Of course, if no one has noticed, politicians are just that, right? Shameless, truly shameless. Now, 87% of people say, Asukare, you're shameless, we don't want you. Logically, they must react somehow to restore order. So that's yet another one of Saramago's amazing books. As you can see, it's all about social themes. Everything revolves around society, and it's based on our blindness, both when we were blind, when we were able to see, and also when we couldn't see, and the politicians, when we already wish to remove them, but there's no way to remove them. We are blind because we can't get them out. There's no human way, because someone needs to govern, and the one who governs is just the same as the one before.
Manuel, as we approach the conclusion of the program, I'm curious to ask about your work 22, The War of the Gods. Could you elaborate on how much you incorporate the theme of letters of light and darkness there, particularly regarding the depiction of Christ confronting both light and darkness, akin to how Saramago portrays it in his writing?
Wow, I certainly cannot deny that. I am greatly influenced by Saramago, as I have always admired him deeply as a writer. Thus, many of his ideas, I express them differently. I'm not going to compare myself with Saramago, if you understand me, but, oh yes. In a certain sense, the letters of light and the letters of darkness are not based on Saramago. That was my idea. Yet it always relates to our blindness. The blindness and the inability to break free from the status quo which we exist. Because you cannot replace the rulers with others, since ultimately they remain the same. You've seen revolutions like Russia's, a revolution, perhaps justified by the alarming oppression the people faced. But what was gained by ending up in a far worse situation. So as you mentioned, I want to discuss one of Saramago's most remarkable books, The Uncertainties of Death. His novel also features an imaginary country, which is meant to be Portugal. Suddenly, because death becomes weary of them all, as they are constantly criticizing it, questioning why they have to die, asking, hey, why should I die? Well, this is where I leave you. You won't die anymore. So, suddenly, there are no more deaths in the country. How does this change society? This leads to a serious issue. Some businesses, like funeral homes, go bankrupt if no one dies. Insurance companies, why buy life insurance if you won't die? They try to adapt, and now insurance isn't paid until 160 years old. But people don't want to live, so mafias form and they take people out of the country who want to die, charging families a high cost and all that then. People want to die then. Mafias take them out to die. Society, but who will care for the elderly and future old people? Because if we're to live forever, who will care for us all? Naturally, these issues I mentioned are mirrored in our social life. If we were immortal, as discussed in Harari's book, Homo Deus, who will care for all those old people? Who will care for them? And what condition will they be in? Because death in this book doesn't allow you to die, yet you keep aging. You end up becoming a burden on both your family and society. Picture a man who is 125 years old, continuing that, and unable to die. This is the dilemma. Death is essential. In the end, death is regenerative. However, when he talks about the death of individuals, he is actually referring to the death of the current society as it is perceived. In other words, you must always consider those conditions or premises that Saramago aims to present.
Well, Manuel, and I would ask you at the level of those titles that you chose, for example, 22, The War of the Gods, where we are talking of texts that have come to transform the Christian vision, the vision of Christ. Of all this, as you mentioned with this writer, José Saramago, how much your book 22, The War of the Gods, could also be considered? A text that confronts the vision of the beliefs?
Well, my text, the issue is the issue is the limited readership through diffusion. If my book suddenly became a bestseller, then logically it would be quite controversial. Very controversial. However, like many writers who remain unread despite their work, I don't see why I would be different and suddenly gain widespread readership.
But Manuel, maybe in the way you present your works, there is also that element of questioning. People might be afraid to challenge their own beliefs and their own understanding of what they have been told about Saramago. Now, with the emergence of all these apocryphal texts, our perspective is literally altered, offering us a completely different narrative, or perhaps a complementary one, which might be closer to reality. So, that's the dilemma.
Yes, there it is. As I said, Christianity has been around for 2,000 years, forming the basis of Western civilization, changing something that has been with us so long is generational. New generations are becoming less religious daily, questioning these things more. But for those raised in Catholicism and Christianity, such things won't change their views. Their vision won't change, right? Without Christ in Christianity, belief in hell and purgatory is impossible. If you were to pose that question to Christianity, it would essentially bring Christianity to an end. So why would individuals question beliefs that have been instilled in them since childhood? How could they begin to question the concepts of heaven and hell? In today's world, a person who values science, using logic, typically does not accept the existence of heaven or hell. In my book, something I stress quite a bit is the notion that hell is present here, as is purgatory. For some, life is purgatory. Most find it so, as no one is free from sadness. If not one thing, it's another: death, ruin, job loss. Life is full of depression. But it's purgatory because you eventually move forward. Some live in hell, never advancing, facing poverty. Hindus address it. Karma. The social castes. This person has reincarnated in society's lowest caste due to bad past lives. And now they have Gandhi attempted to change that concept, but he never succeeded. In India today, girls are gang raped and burned because they belong to a lower caste. And after the rape, they burn them. It's brutal, which doesn't have a name, isn't it true? When I mention the Indians, it's important to note that while you might not be very pacifist, there are certain groups among them who are extremists and capable of extreme actions. However, generally speaking, it's precisely because of their doctrines and beliefs that you find yourself in the position you are today. And in a way, that is actually a form of understanding Christianity. That is precisely why, when I mention in my book that Christ travels to Tibet carrying the Hindu doctrines, it essentially means the same thing. You see, Hindus hold the belief that someone who is a president of the government or a businessman of a large multinational corporation is in that position because God has willed it. They think he has been so virtuous in previous lives that God has rewarded him with such a status. Meanwhile, the poor individual living in a slum in Calcutta, collecting garbage, well, according to this belief, it is because he deserves his situation. Because if it is not God, he'll place it there, unless he must atone for past actions. Basically, all religions are similar. It depends how you interpret.
Well, Manuel, here is the invitation for our audience. Well, first of all, for them to enjoy these books and to make an exercise of questioning. And I thank you very much. Just for those who are interested in acquiring, not only 22, the War of Gods, but also 11, The Secret Code, and Nostradamus, another book that has also been a very successful novel in Spain. So I thank you very much, Manuel. And where else can we reach out to you? And how can people get in touch with you?
It would be on my social networks at the end of the program, and you can find all my books on Amazon in both physical and digital formats. We can get them as physical books, e-books, or audible to listen.
Thank you, Manuel. This program has been a great literary adventure, teaching us much from these Nobel-winning writers' perspectives.
Exactly, and well earned.
Thanks, Manuel. See you next time.
Catch you later, Jesus.